Welcome back, everyone, to another spine-tingling episode. Today we're venturing into the heart of some of the creepiest real-life cornfield horror stories that will leave you questioning what's truly lurking in the shadows of the fields. These chilling tales come from people who've experienced the unexplainable, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for your continued support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions mean the world to us, and we're so grateful to have you as part of our growing community. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, and let's uncover the eerie secrets that lie hidden in the cornfields. You never know what might be waiting out there. Story 1: Field of Horror. I was born into the barren sprawl of rural Nebraska, in a town that barely existed on the map, just a few weathered buildings on the edge of a desolate plain. The land around us was all that remained: miles of flat, colorless farmland, the crops tilled and cultivated under an indifferent sky. Our house stood at the edge of a vast cornfield, a place that seemed as ancient as the earth itself, where the rustling of the stalks was a constant reminder that life, if it could be called such, was born of nothing but dry, sterile soil. I remember the cornfield with an unsettling clarity, though it has been years since I last saw it. It loomed behind our house, an impenetrable wall of green that stretched beyond the horizon. The rows of corn were so dense, so perfectly aligned, that they seemed to form a vast, silent labyrinth, an unnatural maze that whispered its secrets only to the wind. And always, at the edge of my hearing, there was a hum, an inexplicable, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the field. My parents, particularly my mother, spoke of the cornfield as one speaks of a dangerous animal, something whose nature could not be understood, but whose malice was evident. "Never go into the corn," she would say with a nervousness I couldn't understand at the time. "Never go near it. It's not safe there, not safe for anyone. Do you hear me?" Her voice had a tremor to it, as if speaking about the cornfield conjured something far worse than mere words could convey. I would nod, as any child does, and pretend to understand, though a part of me always wondered why. What was so terrifying about it? What could there possibly be in a field of tall, swaying stalks of corn that could cause such fear? I never asked. It didn't matter. After all, children are born with a need to rebel, to push boundaries, to test the very rules set before them. It's the way of things. And the cornfield, like all forbidden things, was an irresistible draw, its mystery, its quiet threat, as alluring as it was terrifying. One afternoon, as I pedaled home from school, the chain of my bike snapped suddenly, without warning. The road, once smooth and familiar beneath my tires, became a series of jolts and jerks. I had no choice but to stop, stranded in the middle of the dirt road, with no one around for miles. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the earth. The air was still, and the field beyond me stretched out, a silent, inviting expanse that seemed to beckon me. I could hear the wind again, faintly, but it was different this time. It wasn't the usual, lazy breeze that drifted through the air, barely ruffling the leaves of the trees. This wind was sharp, dry-cutting, and it carried with it the softest of murmurs, a whispering sound that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the field. The wind. I could not ignore them. I stood there, alone, with the sun sinking lower, the shadows growing longer, and the cornfield pressing in, filling the horizon. My parents' warnings, their cryptic fear, echoed in my mind, but I was already moving before I could stop myself. I dropped my bike and pushed through the dry stalks, feeling the rustling movement of the plants around me, their leaves brushing against my skin like the cold touch of something unseen. The change was immediate. The air within the cornfield was thick, heavier than it had been outside. I could feel it pressing down on me, like a force I could not see but could not escape. The scent of the earth was richer here, but also tainted, like something rotting beneath the surface. The corn swayed in rhythm, as if it were alive, breathing in time with some distant, unseen pulse. The murmurs grew louder, more distinct. At first, they were indistinguishable fragments of sound carried on the wind whispers that seemed to come from everywhere, swirling in the air around me. But as I ventured deeper into the field, they became clearer, sharper, too clear. It was as if they were meant for me alone, a voice from somewhere beyond the reaches of human understanding. I froze. The sound. Shuffling behind me, heavy and deliberate footsteps, slow and dragging. But there was no one there. I spun around, my heart racing, but the field was empty. The wind had ceased, and the air around me became even thicker, as though it had solidified into something dense and suffocating. And then through the row of corn, I saw him. A man, no, not a man. He moved with an odd, jerky gait, as though his limbs were not properly attached to his body. His clothes were ragged, torn in places, his arms and legs covered in deep, jagged scratches, as if the very earth had torn at him, had consumed him. He was tall, unnaturally so, his body bent in a way that seemed wrong, distorted. His face, oh, his face. It was not a face that belonged to a man. It was hollow, the skin stretched too tightly over the bones, and his eyes, those empty, wide eyes, void of any human emotion, but full of a deep, hungry knowledge. When our gazes met, a twisted smile spread across his lips, a smile that twisted something in my gut. "Hey kid," he rasped, his voice low, filled with something dark and primal. "Come here." The words hung in the air, far too thick with meaning to be ignored, and yet I could not move. I could not react. I was caught in that moment, locked in place, as though the very space between us had frozen. His smile widened, more grotesque with each passing second, and the weight of it pressed down on me, harder than the air itself. Something in me snapped. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I ran blindly, the corn crashing against me as I pushed forward, the stalks catching at my arms and legs like claws, dragging at my skin. Behind me, I could hear him, his heavy, dragging footsteps coming closer. His breath, ragged and wet, filled the air like a sickening fog. "Come back." "I won't hurt ya," he called after me, but there was no reassurance in his voice. There was nothing human left in it. It was the voice of something that had long ago shed its humanity, that had become a thing of pure hunger and malice. I stumbled, my feet tangling in the dry corn, and I fell hard against the earth. The world around me spun as I pressed my face into the dirt, struggling to catch my breath. The corn whispered in my ears, the voices from nowhere growing louder, pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear him now, coming closer, the sound of his movement like an animal, slow, deliberate, and hungry. I held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut, praying that the earth might swallow me whole, that the field would take me, that somehow I might disappear before he found me. But I knew it was pointless. I knew it was too late. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The footsteps, the breath, the whispers, everything. The world went silent. Too silent. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. When I finally dared to open my eyes, there was no one there. The field, once alive with the murmur of the wind, was still. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing, sharp and ragged in the oppressive silence. I crawled out of the cornfield, my body trembling, my mind spinning with questions I could never answer. When I reached the road, I saw my bike exactly where I had left it, untouched, as though nothing had happened. No sign of the man. No sign of anything. I fled back home, never once looking back. For weeks after that, I avoided the cornfield. I stayed away from its edge, never daring to venture close, though the field seemed to call to me, whispering with its quiet, insistent hum. But it wasn't until we moved, until we left that place behind, that I thought I had escaped whatever had been waiting for me in that field. The day we left, as I stood by the car, I saw at my bike, the one I had left behind, the one I had dropped in the chaos of my flight. There it was, sitting neatly on the porch, not a scratch on it, as if it had been placed there by some unseen hand. I asked my parents, but they just looked at each other, their faces pale and drawn. My father muttered something about the neighbors, but I knew deep down, I knew it was not the neighbors who had returned my bike. We left that place behind, but even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching, waiting just beyond the horizon, just beyond the reach of understanding. The man in the cornfield. The field itself. They have never truly let me go. And sometimes when the wind is still, when the shadows grow long and the air thickens, I can hear it again, the faint, distant hum, the whispers calling my name. Story 2: The Shadow in the Cornfield. It had been years since I had last set foot on the farm. The years I spent in the city, clutching at the frayed threads of an aspiration that, to be honest, felt more and more like a thin veneer over a well of hollow discontent, had driven me away. The city, with its hum and clatter, had swallowed me whole. But even as the noise of urban life began to erode the edges of my sense of self, I could not escape the call of the land. So when my parents, already hunched under the weight of age and declining health, needed help with the farm, I found myself returning to the place I had once fled, as if by some strange inevitability. The house was the same, of course. It had not changed. How could it? The same creaking floorboards groaned beneath my feet. The same heavy, stale scent of hay and earth filled the rooms, those smells I had once found suffocating. Yet now they filled me with a strange, nostalgic ache, as if the very air had become a map of something I could no longer remember. The years spent in the city had stripped me of the skills that once allowed me to breathe here, and yet now that I had returned, it felt like I had never truly left. The farm had become something else, a prison of memory and inertia. Any time, it seemed, had stalled here, but not in a way that offered peace. No, this place had always been a reminder of stagnation, of life stalled in its most essential form, rotting at the core. And the cornfield. Always the cornfield. The house stood at the edge of it, a vast sea of stunted green and pale stalks that stretched for miles, swallowing the horizon in its monotonous rhythm. I could never look at it without feeling a shudder and uneasy, knowing that, should I venture into its depths, it might take me as it had taken so many before. There were whispers in the wind, though I cannot say where they came from, tales of men and children who had wandered too deep and never returned. But those were just old stories, weren't they? It wasn't until evening that I first noticed the figure. I had been sitting on the porch, wrapped in the quiet, suffocating darkness of rural Nebraska, my hands clutching the steaming mug of coffee. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of muted red and orange, a final burning flare before the night took over. The stillness of the farm had become almost oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. At first, I thought nothing of it. A man, or perhaps a silhouette of one, standing at the edge of the cornfield, far beyond the reach of the porch light. I assumed it was one of the few neighbors who had perhaps wandered too far from the road, lost in thought or some quiet routine. But the figure did not move. Not once. I dismissed it as an illusion. The tired eyes of a man who had spent far too many hours in solitude, his mind unraveling, knitting together threads of nothing into something that seemed tangible only because it could not be dismissed. Yet the figure remained, an unblinking sentinel at the edge of the cornfield, as though waiting for something, waiting for me perhaps. This, of course, was absurd. The world was a logical place, after all. Even here, in the vast emptiness of the plains, the rules held. Or so I told myself. The next evening, the figure returned. Again, it stood at the edge of the cornfield, motionless, just outside the reach of the light from the porch. And again, I told myself it was nothing, just some figment of an overworked mind. But there was something about it, something that set the hairs on the back of my neck on edge. A subtle pull in the air, a tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface of the night. It was always the same. It didn't move, it didn't speak, it just stood there, watching. The wind had begun to stir in the evening hours, and the sky was draped in thick, looming clouds that threatened a storm. The farm seemed to shift under the oppressive weight of the weather, the air growing thick with moisture, and my thoughts with it murky, unsettled, like something at the edges of my perception, just out of reach. I hadn't meant to go out there, not really. But as the days passed, the figure became a fixture in my mind, a thing I could neither dismiss nor confront. Its presence began to take shape, to pulse with a strange rhythm that echoed in my chest. And so, on a night that felt no different than any other, I found myself stepping out onto the porch once more, my heart beating a little too fast in my chest, my feet moving without the guidance of thought. The figure was there again at the edge of the cornfield, just beyond the pool of light that stretched from the porch. This time it did not feel like an apparition. It felt real. Too real. I moved toward it cautiously, silently, my breath shallow in my chest. As I neared, the figure slowly turned its head in my direction, as though it had been waiting for me all along. It was a man, or something that resembled a man, standing impossibly still amidst the rustling stalks. His face, though obscured in shadow, was pale, drawn tight as if pulled by unseen strings. He wore dark clothes, blending into the night around him, and he did not move as I approached. He simply stood, staring, watching. And then, as if he had never been there at all, he turned, and without a sound, vanished into the cornfield. The way he moved, or rather did not move, was unnatural, as though he were part of the field itself, an extension of it, drifting between the rows of corn stalks with a quiet, almost imperceptible grace. I froze. The stillness of the night pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. My breath hitched in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. It could have been anyone, couldn't it? A neighbor, perhaps. Someone just out for a walk, who had simply wandered too far and lost himself in the night. But as I stood there, trembling with the weight of an unnameable dread, I knew it was something else, something I could not explain, not in any rational way. The next morning I walked to the neighbor's house, a small farmhouse at the end of the dirt road. I asked the elderly woman who lived there if she had seen anyone near the cornfield the previous evening. Her face tightened as she looked at me, eyes narrowing, before she spoke in a low, almost frightened voice. "No," she said, shaking her head. "We don't go out there. Too dangerous. With the animals and the weather. We don't venture too far, especially at night." I thanked her and returned to the farm, but the unease in my chest had only grown. The figure had returned, and now every night it seemed to be a little closer, a little more insistent, as though it were waiting for something, waiting for me. The distance between us, once so vast, had shortened with each passing day, each passing evening. It was always the same. The figure, at the edge of the cornfield, watching. Then came the night the power went out. It was a frequent occurrence on the farm, what with the unpredictable storms that rolled in from the plains. But this time, when I stepped outside to check the breaker, I saw him again. The man, standing just beyond the porch light, was holding something now. A tool rusted dark and glinting faintly in the moonlight. A long, twisted garden tool, like something from another era. He did not move, but his presence was closer now, palpable in the damp, heavy air. I don't know why, but I turned and ran. The door slammed behind me, and I fumbled for my phone, dialing the police with trembling fingers. The words tumbled out of me in a frenzy as I explained the situation, describing the figure, the tool, the unease. They promised to send someone, but by the time the police arrived, there was no trace of the man. The field, the corn, was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The police checked the area and found nothing. They assured me that it was probably just some kid, or perhaps a prank. But I knew better. The fear that gripped me that night, the terror that I could not explain, had not left. I was not safe, not in my own home. The figure never left. Night after night it remained, watching, waiting. I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I packed my things, said goodbye to my parents, and left without a word. The farm, the place I had once called home, had become a prison, and I could not stay another night. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder if the figure was still out there, standing at the edge of the cornfield, waiting for someone else to come home. Some things are best left undisturbed. Some places, no matter how much you try to return to them, will never be safe. Story 3: The Haunting of the House Near the Cornfield. I had no intention of finding this place. It was not a place I sought, nor a place I ever thought I would come to. But in the end, I found myself drawn to it, as if by some unseen force. The house near the cornfield, the one at the edge of the world, seemed to appear out of nowhere, a thing that had always existed, waiting for me to stumble upon it. Perhaps I had come to it because there was nowhere else to go, and perhaps because, somewhere deep inside me, I had always known that the world was not meant to be a place of comfort or ease. It had been waiting for me quietly, as if I had been expected to arrive at some inevitable moment. It began with the silence. In the city, the noise had been a constant. The hum of voices, the buzz of electric lights, the constant barrage of human presence, a noise that pressed upon my mind and crushed any remnants of peace. But here, in this forgotten corner of Iowa, there was only the quietest silence, so deep, so suffocating it felt like the air itself had solidified, becoming as dense and unyielding as stone. The house, when I first saw it, was an old cottage, worn by years and weather, sitting at the edge of an untamed cornfield. The house itself seemed as much a part of the land as the very soil beneath it. The wood of its walls was splintered and faded, and the paint, what little of it remained, had long since peeled away, leaving the structure exposed to the elements, its history apparent in the marks and stains upon its skin. I had no reason to be drawn to it, no reason except that it was there. And it was cheap, too cheap for a place so isolated, but the realtor assured me that its condition was the only reason for the price. The remoteness, she said, had driven down its value. She did not mention the house's history. She did not mention what it had been before I came. Perhaps she did not know. Or perhaps she did, but something within her had prevented her from speaking the truth. The property was bordered by a rickety fence, half sunk in the overgrowth of weeds and wild grass. The fence, much like the house itself, seemed to be slowly subsumed by the land, as if nature were reclaiming it, taking back what had once been forced into submission. The air, always thick with the smell of earth, carried an undertone of decay, a strange fragrance, both inviting and suffocating, that seemed to pull you deeper into the land with each breath. It was a smell that carried with it the weight of something ancient, something that had been here long before I arrived and would likely remain long after I was gone. I told myself I had come here to escape, to seek a kind of peace that could not be found in the clamor of the city, but deep within I suspected that peace had never truly been what I was after. It was the absence of life, the absence of human touch, that I had sought. It was the stillness, the nothingness, that had drawn me here. Perhaps it was an escape, yes, but an escape to a place where I could lose myself not just from the world, but from something even deeper, something more intrinsic, more inescapable. The house, this strange house, seemed to offer that to me. It was a sanctuary in the most fundamental sense, a place that would never ask for anything in return. The first day I spent here, I stood by the window gazing out across the field. The corn stretched endlessly before me, a rolling sea of green, its tops swaying in the breeze like the murmurs of distant voices. I could not see the far end of the field. It was as if the land itself had been designed to swallow the horizon, as though it existed outside of time and space. The rows of corn seemed to stretch endlessly, until they disappeared into some unreachable distance, beyond the pale light of the sun and into the darkness that awaited after dusk. The rustling of the stalks, the gentle brushing of the leaves against one another, was constant and eerie, rhythmic sound that followed me wherever I went. It was a sound that seemed to draw me in, to wrap itself around me like a shroud, filling my thoughts with the quiet intensity of something that was not quite there. It was a whisper that seemed to speak of things I could not understand, things I had not yet learned. I should have found comfort in the solitude, but I did not. It was a kind of emptiness that did not allow for peace. In the silence of the house, in the endless, whispering fields, I began to sense something watching me, something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of the land, waiting for me to arrive. There was no evidence of it, not in any tangible form, but there was an oppressive presence in the air, something that made my chest tighten, that made my heart quicken when I turned my back to the window, as though something stood just behind me, unseen but never absent. The house itself felt strange alive, almost as though it had been waiting for me, and now that I was here, it began to stir. The walls creaked and groaned at night, as though they were sighing in their sleep, and I would hear the faintest sound from upstairs, the subtle creaking of the old wooden floorboards, the sound of movement where none should have been. At first I thought it was the wind, but as time went on, I grew less sure. There was something deliberate about it, as if the house were trying to tell me something, or perhaps to remind me of something I had forgotten. The wind itself had a voice, a soft, sibilant murmur that seemed to speak in languages I could not grasp. It was as though the air itself carried messages from beyond the world, whispered secrets from some long-forgotten time. I spent my days in the rocking chair by the window, watching the field, watching the sun's slow arc across the sky. It was as though the days had no end. The light would change, subtly, the shadows shifting imperceptibly as the sun moved, but the landscape never seemed to change. The field, the house, the sky, everything was locked in place, as though it existed outside of the passage of time. I would sit and stare, lost in the slow movement of the world around me, and yet beneath it all, something stirred. A vague sense of unease settled in my chest, something I could not define but which gnawed at me nonetheless. And then, the figures began to appear. At first I told myself they were just tricks of the mind. The field was vast after all, and the light played strange tricks on the eye. But I saw them figures, standing just beyond the edge of the field, at the limit of my vision. I would blink and they would be gone, but I knew they had been there. Sometimes at night when I stood at the window, I could swear I saw them moving between the rows of corn. The figures were never distinct, always shapeless, their forms shifting in the moonlight like shadows that refused to be defined. And when I turned away, when I looked back, they were always gone. At first I dismissed it. The isolation was enough to unsettle the mind, I thought. But the more I saw them, the less I was able to convince myself it was nothing. The presence of those figures, the sense of something watching me from the field, grew heavier, more oppressive. It was as though the land itself had begun to bleed into my consciousness, as though the boundaries between the house, the field, and myself were beginning to blur. I could feel it, something was changing. Something was drawing me closer to the field, to the edge of it, to the point where the land itself would swallow me whole. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the horizon and the sky bled into deep purples and blacks, I walked outside. The air was colder now, the land holding its breath as the night settled in. I could hear the whispering of the field, the rustling of the corn, its sound more insistent than ever. The figures were there again, standing just beyond the edge of the field, watching. I felt their eyes upon me, though I could not see their faces, and something stirred within me, an urge to move closer, to step into the field, to cross over to the place where I would never return. I hesitated for a moment, caught between the strange pull of the field and the creeping dread that had taken hold of my heart. But before I could move, I heard a voice, soft, insistent, a whisper that curled around my name like a serpent. "Come closer." The words were not mine to hear. They did not come from a person. They came from the field, from the earth itself, carried on the wind. The voice had weight, thickness to it, like something long buried, something that had been waiting for me. And then I knew that I was not meant to leave. I was not meant to escape. This place had called me, drawn me in, and now was asking for me. The house, the field, the land, they had been waiting for me to arrive. Waiting for me to cross that line, to step beyond the edge where there was no return. Waiting for me to become one with the silence, to dissolve into the dark embrace of the earth itself. I cannot explain it. I cannot tell you why I stayed, why I let the land pull me into its depths. But in the quiet that followed, I knew that I had not come to this place by accident. It had chosen me, and now I was part of it, part of the land, part of the house, part of the waiting silence. Perhaps in the end, I was always meant to be here. And in that realization, I found peace. As we close today's video featuring these spine-chilling, real Cornfield horror stories, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for your incredible support. Your engagement, comments, and subscriptions are what make this channel so special, and we couldn't be more grateful for such a dedicated and growing community. We hope today's tales gave you that uneasy feeling, making you think twice the next time you find yourself near a cornfield. Remember, some secrets are better left undiscovered. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay curious and beware what might be lurking in the fields.